Okay, continuing our discussion of JavaScript proper, let's talk about functions in JavaScript. You're going to become really good friends with them because they're like the only way work gets done in JavaScript is functions. As I mentioned, they're closures and they're first-class objects. First class means you can pass them around. Closures means that you can rely on the fact that whatever is in scope where the function is first defined is going to be in scope when you execute it later. So we've seen lambda expressions. Berkeley students saw them in 61A. We've also seen them in this class in the form of do blocks that you can pass around in Ruby like iterators use. So this is the exact same idea. And here's a simple example. Make times is a variable whose value is a function, right? And you'll often see function, you'll see this kind of declaration. I actually prefer the first kind of declaration because it makes it clear that make times is just a plain old variable whose value happens to be a function. And that's the JavaScript way of thinking. It's not like you have variables and then separately from them you have functions. A function is just another kind of value, and you can pass it around and assign it to things. So I actually prefer the first syntax because it makes that explicit. So make times is a function of one argument that returns a function that essentially has captured this argument in a closure, right? So we can do a make times of 2 and a make times of 3, and then we can use them as functions. Note that unlike Ruby, remember that in Ruby, you can do this shortcut where if you have a function that doesn't take any arguments, or even if it does take arguments, you can omit the parentheses around the argument list as long as it doesn't cause ambiguity. You can see here why you can't do that in JavaScript, right? Because a function is a first-class object, the name of a function without any parens after it is just a reference to that actual function. It's a way that you could pass the function object to somebody, for example. Whereas the name of a function followed by possibly empty parentheses is explicitly a call to that function, perhaps with no arguments. So it's an important distinction. And it's a particularly important distinction because it's legal to omit the parentheses, but it doesn't mean what it means in Ruby. As I said, a really common way that functions are organized, because they're first class and you can assign them to things, is to make functions be properties of an object. So for example, I could, following this convention of I'm going to declare a single global variable to hold all of my app's JavaScript stuff, here I'm declaring a JavaScript variable RP, and I'm declaring it outside the scope of any function, so it's going to be global. In this instance, I omitted the keyword var because when you use var but you're not inside any scope, it turns out to be global anyway, right? So it wouldn't have made any difference in this example. And now I'm setting some properties of this object, and these two functions, or these two properties, setup and get movie info, are both function valued properties. They're just regular, it's like a hash, but these values are functions instead of some simple type. And again, the pitfalls, I know that you have to kind of switch your brain between Ruby mode and Java mode. In Ruby mode, we tried to hammer home that whenever you see a dot, it means calling a method on a receiver. Not in JavaScript, right? In JavaScript, it really is you're just accessing a property of an object. And in a minute, we'll talk about what happens if you try to access a non-existent property of an object. You don't have to declare your properties in advance. So when I reference rp.setup, that property springs into existence. It's like assigning a value to a hash key, essentially. Another way that I could have done this same task is I could have just declared rp as an object, right? And again, notice subtle differences in punctuation. This is why you want a good JavaScript mode in your IDE or in your editor, and why you want to use tools like JSLint. In this example, every JavaScript statement ends with a semicolon. Well, there's actually complicated rules about when it doesn't have to, but just assume that they all do. It's much easier, you make fewer errors. So here's, RP is a blank hat, or an empty object, semicolon. I'm setting one property of it, semicolon. I'm setting another property of it, semicolon. Whereas here, what am I doing? I'm starting an object, and it's basically a list of key value pairs, right? So each key is followed by a colon followed by the value. That means I need a comma at the end. Make sense? Right? Key colon value, comma, key colon value, comma, and so on until the end of the object. I have no strong preference between these two. Use whichever one looks nice to you. So let's do a quick sanity check on functions in JavaScript. Which statement is not true about JavaScript functions? They can be anonymous. They always return a value, even if that value might be undefined. They can be passed a function as an argument. And they can execute concurrently with other functions. Which is not true?